welcome everyone to Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of 2 books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. In recent years, stories have arisen in both the U.S. and Canadian media describing generations of horrendous physical, sexual, and verbal abuse suffered by First Nations or Native American children in church-run, government-sanctioned residential schools. Often, white Americans or Canadians get the impression that these are old stories just come to light, when actually they are deep traumas endured by generations of Native Americans. Although it was news to us, it was never news to them. But it has left us wondering how this could happen, and how did the church come to have such a prominent role in this kind of historical tragedy or nightmare. In fact, the stories in the media created such a public outcry that Pope Francis earlier this year visited Canada to issue an apology of sorts for the church's failure to protect these children. And here to talk about these issues, as well as her own story, is Bev Sellers, who is chief of the Zasul First Nation in Williams Lake, British Columbia. She holds a degree in history from the University of Victoria and a law degree from the University of British Columbia. She's been an outspoken activist on behalf of her own and other First Nations, and has served as an advisor to the British Columbia Treaty Commission. She's also the celebrated author of a best-selling book, They Called Me Number One, a memoir of her childhood years spent at a Canadian Indian residential school. Welcome, Bev Sellers, and thank you for making time for us this evening.
Thank you very much. I would just like to correct one thing, is I'm no longer chief. I was an elected chief, so I'm a former chief. I've served for 12 years.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Did I pronounce that right? Satsul?
Hatsul.
Hatsul.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I think before we dive into your experiences at the St. Joseph's School, let's paint some historical backdrop for our listeners and describe what these schools were and the policies of the Canadian and American government and the church their policies that created these schools. What were these schools created to do?
Well, according to the Canadian government, it was to get rid of the Indian in the children, and like they were created because when the government and there's a whole reason how they came, or there's a whole history about how they came into power into Canada and the United States, but Native people were in the way, and I believe it was the government's policy to try to assimilate Indigenous people into the general population, and in doing so, they couldn't. Native people had their own culture, and didn't want to join the other non-Indigenous culture, and so the government took measures to force them to try to assimilate them, and Indian reserves were made where Native people were not allowed, to leave the reserves without a pass from the Indian agent, and then the children were taken from their parents and grandparents because the government said that leaving them on the reserve, they grew up, and going to school on the reserve, they grew up to be just savages who could read and write. So they wanted to break that cultural identity in the children, and so it became Canadian law for children from some as young as 4 years old, mostly 5, 6, 7, to be taken from their parents and placed in residential schools. My grandmother, who was born in 1896, was the first in our family to attend these schools, my mom went, all her brothers and sisters, and then I was the last one. I went there until 1967. So, yeah.
I imagine, and maybe this just sounds cynical of me, but I imagine also one of the motivations for creating these schools and creating future generations of Native Americans or First Nation children who were basically stripped of their identity, cultural identity, and language, would be to get the government to get their hands on the land, because I imagine if once you have the children fully basically anglicized, I guess you would say, there would be no further reason for Native American reserves or reservations, and the government could get their land. Is that true? Is that part of the motivation?
Definitely part of the motivation. I mean, Native people were a blockage in the non-Indigenous people going across Canada and developing the lands, and there was a real clash of cultures. The way Native people saw the land was that it provided you with everything you needed to survive, and so you didn't you only took what you needed. And when the first non-Indigenous people came to the Americas, they couldn't believe the wealth that existed here, and that's because it was Native people treated it more of as a garden than something to conquer. Whereas the non-Indigenous people felt that you had to conquer the land and they said that the Native people weren't using it, but there are different forms of use, and instead of now you have so much resource extraction, and that's why we're in the mess we're in today with all of the waters and lands being just resources just stripped from them. So yes, it was definitely a clash of culture, and their idea of economics was to take everything from the land.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, we're in a position now when we can learn from First Nations and how they lived in relationship with the land, relationship with nature, rather than, as you say, having an adversarial relationship with created things.
Yeah.
We've learned that the hard way.
Yeah. And now people are looking to Indigenous people. I mean, the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said on a couple of occasions that, in order for us to really protect the land, we have to involve, we have to participate and, involve the Indigenous people in their way of living in harmony with the land. And, so and now people are looking at the way Indigenous people used to parent as well. There's been a couple of books out about the way they parented and how much better it was for the child, and so it's all it's coming around now, where the Indigenous way of life is seen as a better way than what was introduced to us. But for years, it was against the law for us to practice any of our cultures, any of our cultural practices. So.
Now, you described the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Canadian government. It's a kind of unholy alliance. Can you describe that relationship, and how did that give birth to these schools?
Well, the Catholic Church and other churches came into Canada, their missionaries or whomever, and they weren't able to really convince the indigenous people that their way of life was a better way of life. And if you read some of the early comments in the history books about the chiefs of the community, and they didn't like the way that the indigenous people thought their ways were better, and so the Catholic Church needed, and others needed, to somehow make the indigenous people adopt their way of life. And so these schools, there was the government funded them very, I guess you could call it funded. They gave the schools so much money. I'm not sure how much money per child, but it wasn't enough to really for the students to be comfortable and have everything there. But it was a way for the church to get a hold of the children and bring them into their environment and pretty much brainwash them into, their way of thinking. And so you get a child at a very vulnerable age, and you just dictate to them, our lives were dictated to us 24/7. We weren't allowed to, we could think, but we weren't allowed to voice those thoughts. And, fear was the most common emotion that myself and others felt at these schools, because you were just programmed, yes, sister, no, sister, yes, father, no, father. Those were we were like little robots at these schools, and just scared to get into trouble because, if you did something, even the slightest little thing that you weren't supposed to, we got the strap with a conveyor belt, piece of a conveyor belt that had been cut off, and that's what they used to strap us. And it hurt, really hurt.
Now, you had mentioned your grandmother as having attended one of these schools, and perhaps other members or generations of your family. What was that like growing up? Did they share their stories or their experience with you? What was their... Go ahead.
Yeah, my grandmother and my mom and I, and, it was funny, and I learned later that it was the same for people that went through the Holocaust, is that they only talked to others who went through the Holocaust, and it was the same for us. I only talked to people. We only talked amongst ourselves. My grandmother went, my mother went, my uncles went, my brothers and my older brothers and sisters, not my younger brothers and sisters. But, we would talk amongst each other, and my grandmother hated to send us there. Every time we went back to the mission, she would always tell us, I sure hate to send you kids there, but if you don't go, they'll put us in jail. And it wasn't an idle threat. Other parents were put in jail for not releasing, for not giving up their kids. And so we talked about it, and when it started coming out about these schools, our tribal council was one of the first to because we were trying to see, why is there so much chaos in our community? Why do we have so much drinking? Why is there so much violence in our community? And we were trying to figure out why this was, and we hired a researcher from the University of Guelph to help us, and he started going out and interviewing people in the communities, and all roads seemed to lead back to the residential school. Mm-hmm. And, we're like, holy smokes, and so people there has been so much happening there, and when I first started talking about the residential schools to others, I couldn't do so without crying. I would just bringing back, and I guess that's why we only talked about it with those who had went, because we didn't have to explain where the hurt came from. They knew, and we didn't have to go deep into it. We could just talk about it, and we knew each other's story. But when others started to ask questions and ask, questions that brought you to a place where you didn't want to remember, it was really difficult. And so my kids, They knew that my grandmother, my mom, and I went to these schools, but that's all they knew until later on.
Now, at what age did you start attending St. Joseph's Residential School, and what were your first impressions? What were your first days like?
Well, I was 7 years old when I went there, and I had been away from home 2 years prior to that. I had tuberculosis, and I was sent to a hospital 300 miles south of where I lived, and so I'd already been away from home, and so I knew what loneliness was already. And I got home after I was released from the hospital, and I was home for 3 weeks, and then I was required to go to the residential school. And so I remember the kids crying at night, but I'd been through that in the hospital, so I didn't cry at night, but they were lonesome for their home, and they weren't allowed to be near their brothers or their sisters, and so I remember that. And then it only took a couple of nights. The nun would come out with the strap for anybody that was crying and make them not cry, or they would cry very quietly. And the other thing I remember is learning very quickly to do everything that you were told. We went out, and first morning I was there, we were told to go pick up garbage in the schoolyard. So we went running out, and we each had a bag, and we went and grabbed some garbage and went back in, and then we didn't clean it clean enough, and so we were sent back out, and we missed breakfast that morning. And it just you learn very quickly to do everything the way you were told to, and not to deviate in any way. Otherwise, there were consequences.
What were the relationships among the students? Did you talk with each other about your experience? Were you able to validate each other's experience, or was that something that was also taken away?
You mean while we were at the school?
Yes.
No, we didn't talk about it. It was just the way it was. We all knew the score, and we didn't like what was happening to us, but we didn't talk about it amongst ourselves. And we just, when I first got there, the older girls, some of the older girls did warn me, to do things the way you were supposed to do, and to obey and everything like that. So, but it was later on, like when I was writing the book, they called me number one. I mean, that's those stories in there. Everybody that I mention in there, I talk to them about, like sometimes there was something I would remember, but I wasn't quite sure, the end of it. Like when those girls ran away from the mission, and their heads were shaved, and I knew them, and I got a hold of one of them and got the rest of the story from her. So my book is a compilation of a whole bunch of former students there, and the memories that we had of the place, and filling in each other's memories. Yeah, one of the girls, like I was saying, I don't remember grade 4. My mind is a complete blank for grade 4. And one of the other girls that was in grade 4 with me, she came back. Oh, I don't know. I'd seen her again a while later, and she says, Bev, we were in the same class. She says, I don't have any memories of grade 4 either. And, so that's when we started comparing our stories as adults.
Mm. So you were able to, at a later time, talk to and interview your fellow classmates and fill in the missing pieces and sort of validate that this really happened.
Yes, it was. it was good to connect with a lot of them because some people I hadn't seen since I left the mission. And, they were all so eager, and I really had doubts about putting this book out. My husband is the one that encouraged me, and he didn't go to a residential school. Both his parents did, but he didn't. And, and I was kind of keeping notes and whatever, and then one day I asked him, I said, do you want to read my notes? And he was a prominent Native leader in Canada, and he was absolutely shocked when he read my notes, and he regrets not knowing about the schools, because he said I would have been a better leader if I understood, but he used to get so frustrated with some of the leaders who would, they would see white authority and they would cower right away, and he couldn't understand that, and he would get so angry at them. And after he read my notes and really understood what was going on, he said, I wish I'd known that. But of course, his parents didn't tell him about their time at the school either, so.
Why did you decide to write such a personal and painful memoir as opposed to a more monographic study? What was that journey like? How did you decide to do that? At what point did you say, I have to tell my story?
Well, it wasn't when I started writing. It was when our tribal council decided, when we hired Roland Christian from the University of Guelph to help us with trying to understand our communities, that, and that report came out. And it was only then that I started connecting what happened to me at the residential school to my my dysfunctional adult person, and I started connecting the dots between my childhood and my adult years, and then I started remembering, things, and I started understanding why I was the way I was, and I really wanted to. I started, looking at self-help books and stuff like that, and trying to overcome my dysfunction, and I needed to write about it, and I wasn't going to be a book until my husband, when he read it, and when he read my notes, he says, you have to publish this. And at first I was like, no, it's not for publication. But then when I started talking to the other students and getting, filling in some of the book, and all of them told me that you've got to publish this. And it was my mom, she, at one point she says, and my mom, she was a chronic alcoholic and really had a lot of problems in her life. And it wasn't until I started writing the book, and I was really bitter towards her for a long time. And it was only when I started to understand myself and how my childhood and the mission affected the way I was that I started to understand her. And then I started to understand my family and Native people in general. And my mom, she heard, I don't know where she heard it from, but she says, I heard you're writing a book. You better not be writing anything about me. And I couldn't write the book without writing about my mom, because that was an important relationship that I just couldn't gloss over. So anyways, when I decided to publish it, I finished the draft and I brought it down to my mom, and I put it on the table, and I said, Mom, I've written this. You should read it. And she didn't say anything, and I left, and I waited, and it was 1 week, 2 weeks, and I thought I'd get a phone call from her either swearing at me or telling me, don't you dare publish that, or something like that. And anyway, I hadn't heard from her after 2 weeks. So I went down to see her, and I told her, Mom, did you read the book? And she says, yeah. And I said, what do you think? And she says, you have to publish it, she says. So I think in her reading it, it helped her understand herself. And the story about her when she went to jail for a murder she didn't commit, she wanted that story out, and it's in there. So, yeah, she was happy. And she came with me to a lot of the book, when I would go out and do readings and stuff. She came with me, and she really got into it, and she was happy that it was out there.
Wow, a powerful book that has helped so many and freed so many to talk about their experience and begin to heal in their experience. Could you talk about what was a typical day like growing up in that school, whether it be, first, second, third grade, or whatever you remember best? What was a typical day like? Could you describe it, including any abuse that took place?
Oh, yeah. Well, first time, you wake up to the nun clapping, and there's a lot of mornings, I had a problem with my bladder. A lot of mornings I'd wake up and my bed would be wet. And all of the students that wet the bed would have to get in line and get the strap. And then we had our chores to do before breakfast. Everybody was assigned chores. It doesn't matter how little you were, you had something you had to do. And then we went to breakfast, and then the older students stayed and washed the dishes and got everything tidied up, and then everybody went to class, and we were there for the morning. It didn't matter what grade you were in. It was the same all throughout the years that I was there. Then you went and had lunch and went back to school in the afternoon, and then you had more chores to do, and then supper, and very soon after supper, we went to bed. And it started all over. The only time we had free, Saturday was a big cleanup day. Everybody used to, the whole school had to be cleaned, so we had extra duties on Saturday. And then Sunday, of course, you had Mass. We went to Mass, I can't remember how many times a week, but more than once. And then Sunday was Mass. And then the only free time sometimes we had was Sunday afternoon, where we would go for a walk, always 2 by 2, unless we got to a lake or something, and then we were allowed to spread out a little bit. And every now and again, we would have a treat. They would have hot dogs. We'd have a fire, and we were allowed 2 hot dogs each. So that was a real treat. So that's about the only time. But it was very rigid. Every day was the same. Didn't change.
Now, the title of your book is "They Called Me Number One." Now, how did you arrive at that title? Can you tell the story about that?
Yeah, well, when you got to the mission, or when you got to the residential school, everything was taken from you. Everything. You couldn't keep a bracelet on your wrist or anything from home. Everything had to be taken and put into your suitcase or your bag or whatever, and it was put up into the attic. And then you were given a number, and they no longer called you by your name. Like, for example, the nuns would say, I want numbers 727, 171, and number 1 to clean the chapel, or, stuff like that. Or if they called us, it would be number 1. And then, of course, I would have to respond. And all the students had numbers, and they didn't use our names. So I was number 1 on the girls' side.
Now, I know probably in some schools they would give the students English-sounding names. Why do you think they issued you numbers instead of actual names?
Well, I think because they didn't think of us quite as human beings, or if we were humans, not as good, like a little inferior. So I don't know. Maybe it helped them to treat us the way they did when we were just numbers.
So it sort of helped to justify their treatment. This isn't a person, this is just a number.
Yes.
Wow.
I think so. I mean,
in what other ways did they try to take your culture and your language away?
Well, it was you did not speak any language except English there. English and Latin. They also taught us. Well, they didn't teach us Latin. They taught us how to say the words in Latin, because when I first went there, the Mass was in Latin. So we had to be precise and learn how to answer the priest when we were in church. They didn't explain what it meant. We just had to pronounce it properly and know when to respond to the priest. So they taught us. I wouldn't remember any of it today, but English, you had to speak English, and so many of the former students who went there and who spoke their language were punished. My grandmother, I didn't even realize that she was fluent in her language until she was in her 80s. And there was a girl my brother had a girlfriend from from the area where my grandmother was from. And I was shocked when my grandmother wanted to speak the language with her. And I told her, "Gram, you speak the language?" I said, "Why didn't you ever speak it to us?" And my grandmother didn't get emotional very often, but, she talked about going to the mission, and she said, "They whipped us." And so her and her sister never, ever spoke the language again. And I think she must have been really, for her to get that emotional, she must have been really punished for speaking her language, because she didn't speak English when she first went to the school.
Mm. So in the first half of the book, you describe the experiences of you and generations of your family in this residential school system. And in the second half, you describe your journey of healing and empowerment, and how you went from being a victim or survivor of such horrendous abuse to become chief and a voice for your community. What was that journey like?
Oh, geez. That was a tough journey. And, when I had my kids, I wanted to give them a better life than I had. And I knew that it had to involve some sort of training on my part. And I had been a bookkeeper. I took some bookkeeping courses in Williams Lake, but that didn't lead to anything. And I was making $500 a month, and I had at the time 2 kids to support, and then I basically was a single mother. And then later on, I adopted my sister's boy, and so I had 3. And I knew I needed more than a bookkeeping education, and so I went to Kamloops to Caribou College, and that was the first time my grandmother had moved away from our community since she was 18 years old, and it was quite a shock for her. But I went down there and I took a business admin, 2-year business admin diploma course, and while I was down there, I got word from the elders that they were going to elect me in as chief in the next election, and that kind of scared me. I was like, "Oh my goodness, I don't know anything about being chief." But then I thought, well, can't be can't be any worse than, some of the chiefs we had. so when I
How old were you?
Sorry?
I'm sorry, how old were you at the time?
I was 31 when I was first elected as chief.
Okay.
And, so they elected me in, and, geez, it was quite a learning curve for me. I didn't know anything. I was so green. I mean, there's no training for that, and you're dealing with your family and your community, and I always say that's the hardest job in the world, because you have people that will support you no matter what you do, and you have people, that won't support you no matter what you do. And the dysfunction of the residential school was so strong in our community, so there were, family fights and whatever, and it just was really difficult. And so I was there for 6 years, and during that time, I went to these provincial meetings, and that's where I got my real education in how to be a chief, and listening to people like my husband, Chief Bill Wilson, and George Watts and Joe Mathias, who had been involved with this, and listening to them and at these meetings, and so I was there for 6 years as chief, and I think I made some good decisions and helped the community. But I'd always wanted to go to university, and by this time I'd met Bill, and he encouraged me to go to university, and that's why I went to UVic to get my history degree. And in when I was my first year, and I was wanting, I needed 5 courses for a full course load, and I'd managed to secure 4, but I needed a 5th one. And the only one that I could fit in was a history course. And I knew from what I had been taught at the schools and from what my kids were being taught at the schools that I did not want to take history, because to me it was not history. They left out, if Indigenous people were mentioned, it was just kind of a meaningless whatever. And so I didn't want to take history, but then I couldn't fit anything else into my schedule. And so I thought, oh, geez. Okay, I'll take this history course. I'll suck it up and get the 3 credits and then move on. And when I first went to the course, the first 2 weeks of that course at the University of Victoria, they were talking about history before the newcomers got there. I was shocked. I was just so surprised to find that, that they were teaching that. And so after that, and then showing how the mixture between the Indigenous people and the newcomers and everything like that. And then so I started looking for other content with Indigenous history and found other courses I really liked. And so I ended up majoring in history.
In terms of your emotional or the psychological healing that you went through, spiritual healing, when did that really start? When did that really start to take hold?
Geez. I guess it would have been when I really started to examine the clash of cultures. That would have been, because I know when I went to UVic in 1993, I still, even though I'd been chief of my community for 6 years, I was still really shy and really unsure of myself, and going into university just seemed so intimidating. I wanted when I went and I saw what I found out was a library, and it had four stories to it, and I just wanted to suck all that knowledge into me. I was just really excited to be there, but at the same time I was really intimidated by being there. And then when I started realizing, the clash of cultures, and then re-examining what my grandmother and others in the community had taught me versus how the non-Indigenous world worked, and just examining all that and realizing that what I was feeling, the spiritual sense, of being connected to everything was so powerful to me. And when I would feel at the university, when I would feel out of sorts, I would take my shoes off and connect, with the earth, my bare feet to the earth, and somehow that gave me courage and power to keep on, I guess, because even though I was in a concrete jungle, that helped me. And so any things like that would help me to carry on. I did.
Your relationship with Christianity. Now, you survived years of horrendous abuse at the hands of people who claimed to be representatives of God and doing His work. Did your faith survive, or what is your current relationship with Christianity, or how did that change or be modified over the years?
Well, I don't think I ever really had a solid connection to Christianity, because one of the things that, at the mission, we did things, like I said, like we were little robots, and they didn't, I don't know. I mean, we used to do ceremonies. I remember this one thing where we had to go out and we had to pick rose petals, and then we had to walk in front of the priest, and we had to throw the rose petals on the sidewalk for the priest to walk, and then we walked up to where the Virgin Mary or Mother Mary or whatever was, her statue up by the graveyard. And then there was some sort of ceremony, but nobody ever explained things. We just had to do them. So I didn't have that connection. And then when we were finally able to go to school from home, my grandmother didn't make us go to church, even though she still did. She gave us the option of going or not going, and I never went after that unless it was for a funeral or if somebody was getting married. And then when I started reconnecting to the Indigenous, really thinking about, everything is connected, everything is alive, that to me is what my belief, and I don't go to, and it actually, I did go to, I had a family member that had died not too long ago, and I did go in to hear the sermon or whatever, and I had to leave. I couldn't handle it.
Yeah, understandable. Why do you think it's taken so long for these stories to be heard? And why now at this historical moment? Do you think why is this historical moment when all of a sudden people are coming out telling their stories and people are listening? What is different about today?
Well, when we first started, when that report came out, when we hired Roland Christian to do that report, and it came out, and all of a sudden, I was on the front page of every major newspaper in Canada. And we had TV people coming to do the story. I think it was the Fifth Estate and others, and people were making, films about it and stuff. And there were 4 of us in our tribal council, and there were 3 other chiefs. And they pushed me forward as the spokesperson, and because they hadn't dealt with the abuse. One of them was the son of a priest, and the other two hadn't dealt with the sexual abuse that had happened to them at the school. And even though I hadn't dealt with my issues either, they pushed me forward to be the spokesperson. And that was when I just green again, and I had no idea about media or whatever, and all of a sudden I'm kind of finding myself at the forefront of all of this stuff, and then I started getting hate mail, just hate mail from people, and I couldn't believe it, and I think that and then when my book was coming out, they called me number one. When that was coming out, and those are my granddaughters on the front cover there, and I told my family, please don't let them hear, the hate that you're gonna receive hate mail and whatever. And I said, don't let them hear that. Protect them from that. Anyway, when the book came out, there hasn't been one negative comment towards me. People are so positive and wanting to learn more, and I was like, well, what's the difference? Why all that hate mail? And now, everybody's, horrified at what we're telling them. And I was thinking that in between that time, when we started talking about the Catholic Church, and I think we gave permission to other non-Indigenous people to start talking about their abuses as well. And, and whether it be the United or the Catholic or whatever, or the Boys and Girls Club or hockey, whatever, people in positions of power who have abused kids. And I think that our report and our talking about it allowed them to come out. And so by the time my book came out, people believed it, because if it was just Native people saying this, as has been in the past, they didn't believe us, or they think they were making things up. But with the non-Indigenous coming forward, all of a sudden, these concerns were legitimate, and they needed to take them seriously and whatever. And I think now, because of all of the unmarked graves at these schools, I think it absolutely horrified people. And there's going to be, I pretty well will guarantee that at every residential school there's going to be somewhere where they will find unmarked graves. The way these schools were, the kids never went home. They died there. They were buried there. It would have been way too much for them to send the body home, and so they're just in unmarked graves. And now in Canada too, there are the Indian hospitals where they're starting to look for unmarked graves as well. That's the hospital that I went to from the time I was 5 to 7, and there are other hospitals, but now they're starting to look at that, and because apparently there are a lot of people died there and were never sent home either, and so they're in unmarked graves somewhere. So Globe and Mail just put out a story about that last week.
Do you remember you have any personal memories of fellow students who may have died either from abuse or from suicide or...
lots of them. There was this young... His name was... I can't remember. But he was at the hospital. He was at the hospital that I was at until he was 16, and there are all kinds of stories like that. There was one person in my community who was there for 10 years, and my grandmother told me that her and my grandfather were sent to the hospital, and again, if they didn't go, they were put in jail. and they were sent there, and my grandmother said there was nothing the matter with them, but they had to turn over their pension check every month to the hospital. And she said she talked and talked. They were there for 8 months, and she finally managed to get the hospital to let her and her husband go home. But there's and there was a young guy that came to St. Joseph's Mission. He was 16 years old. He'd been in that hospital 300 miles south of us from, until he was 16. He went there as a young boy, I can't remember. But he came home, or he came to the mission, and then he went to his home community, and he committed suicide. And there are so many people, so many of the former students that I've gone to who've committed suicide or who have died a violent death, because of the trauma that they had in their lives. And I almost was one of them, because it just, I don't know, it just seemed like it was too much to handle. And I'm really happy now that I wasn't successful, but there's so many that have committed suicide.
Well, Beverly Sellers, author of a book called They Called Me Number One, her memoirs about her childhood years in a First Nations residential school in Canada. In terms of survivors of abuse, I've heard it said that the best revenge is a life well lived. And you're certainly an example of that, Beverly. And thank you so much for your courage in sharing your story, which I'm sure positive repercussions not only through your communities, but also into other communities as well where abuse is rampant. And thank you so much for sharing your story, and God bless you in your journey, your continued ministry.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just a note to listeners, currently we broadcast the second Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. On our next broadcast in October, we'll be moving to 8 p.m. So we're moving into prime time. So just to note that next show in October, second week in October, will be at 8 p.m. That's Eastern Time. Thank you so much for tuning in. God bless you all. And this is S.J. Munson signing out.